Hello again, TJ here, and welcome back to 99% Sure. Many people who visit Old North are surprised to learn that there are people buried under the church, but that's actually not the weird part. What's odd is we aren't totally sure who is buried down there. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not that much. To understand how this is the case, let's briefly recap the history. So the first few tombs of the crypt were constructed in 1732, 9 years after the building itself went up. Gradually, they built more as needed, and 100 years later, there were a total of 37. Some bought outright by families, others owned by the church for individual use. And Tomb 37 was the last because space had run out, and yet demand was still high, surprisingly, given the unpleasantness of indoor burials. And not only that, the church had come to rely on the fees from burials to make ends meet. A solution was found, but it makes our question of who even harder. So in the late 1840s, their solution was to begin cleaning out the tombs, collecting the remains and reinterring, i.e. reburying them in a mass grave. To be fair, the practice wasn't totally unheard of for the time, especially in Europe with limited space. Demand was so high that Old North actually had to do this clean out a few times with certain tombs. But eventually, with pressure from the city due to health concerns, indoor burials ceased entirely in 1860. So that wasn't an exhaustive history of the crypt. The tombs being closed in particular has a story for another time. But the point is, even if we pried open the doors, which is generally frowned upon, in order to read the coffin nameplates, the cleanouts mean we still wouldn't have a full list of people. But the situation gets even more confusing. So one complication, wealthy families owned the rights to many of the tombs, and a slight exaggeration, but sometimes it seemed sort of unsupervised. The church was kind of running the show and kind of not. And for those private tombs, we know who owned each tomb, but not always who was buried there. There are a lot of scenarios you can imagine where a family might have reburied ancestors there, opened it up to extended family, etc. Maybe not, but without detailed records, who knows? The church-owned tombs are vague too. The ad hoc approach to the crypt can be seen in an 1805 meeting that raised a committee to, among other things, ascertain the number of tombs now built. Maybe I'm reading into that too much, but it sort of appears that they didn't actually know how many tombs they had. That seems like something they should know. Now, confusing things even more, there was no real master plan for all this. Tombs were added as necessary. Sometimes they switched up their numbering system too. In Tomb 14, the Stranger's Tomb, which is for non-church members, they didn't record names at all. Even former ministers weren't always written about. The Reverend Asa Eaton has a tombstone, and yet, in a research project by Jane Lyden Rousseau, she was unable to find any mention of his burial in the records. And the tomb for the first minister, Dr. Cutler, that was built in 1770, 5 years after his death. So where was he before that? Would we have even known about his burial if this specialty tomb hadn't been built? And while there are some tombstones, they aren't really helpful. Few people got a tombstone back then, and most stones predate the crypt cleanouts. All this is to say that the situation is very confused. Once again, we are limited by the records. There are many things people just didn't take the time to write down back then. Some notes are clear, who died, when, and where they were buried. Others simply state that there was a funeral. The burial could be at Old North or it could be elsewhere. And many people were buried in cemeteries, including two famous members that you'd think would be in the crypt, Robert Newman and John Poling, the likely lantern holders who were buried up the road at Cobb's Hill. So I'll share two bizarre cases from our crypt that show we are often left with more questions than we began. In 1812, when excavating for a new tomb, they stumbled upon a coffin predating the crypt with basically a sort of mummy inside. And the coffin was labeled Mr. Thomas, who died in Bermuda. So what was his story? Was this an exception? And was he reburied in a tomb? Is he still down there? We don't actually know. More recently, in 2017, during a city archaeological survey of the crypt, Tomb 12 was opened to evaluate its condition. This was the first opening in quite a long time. And among the collapsed coffins was a skull, surgically sawn in half, seemingly independent of the rest of its body. The speculation was that it may have been used for medical purposes, then placed in Tomb 12 for some reason. Who this person was, if being buried there was part of their plan, if that speculation is correct at all, it's hard to say. So you may be wondering, is there anything we can say for certain? Well, the records aren't devoid of information. We do know quite a few of the names, especially if we aren't overly concerned if they are still in that tomb or reburied elsewhere. But I see a broader point here too. We get a glimpse of Old North's central role in the community, given that so many people chose it as their final resting place. There's also much to glean from what the tomb records don't say. The absence of people of color who occasionally had funerals here, but with no indication of their place of burial, or the stranger's tomb, with names going unrecorded entirely. Reflecting on that inequality within the community is really important as well. So is there a greater point here? I don't really know. Maybe help a future historian write things down. That seems as good as anything to me. For people back then, they probably didn't feel the need to record diligently because that family, of course, knew where their tomb was and who was buried there. But what was common knowledge back then doesn't always translate well to us today, and there's a lesson there. So when visitors ask who is buried in the crypts, just know that I'm not dodging the question when I say it's a complicated answer. We are still working to put the pieces together. So thanks for joining us for another episode of 99% Sure. Click the link below if you'd like to support the site or help us share our history by sending this video to others. We will be back in a few weeks with our last episode, for now, of 99% Sure. Thanks.